Good morning, and thank you to NBS for inviting me to speak at this Construction Leaders Summit. The last NBS event that I spoke at took place in Birmingham back in February, in front of a live audience, a mere 8 months ago, but it feels like a lifetime given how the world has changed since then. I want to start today by congratulating all of you in the construction industry for the work you have done in responding to the pandemic. You've shown yet again how you can adapt, how you can change when it really matters, getting people back to work safely with stringent new measures in place and helping to restart the economy. But I also want you to take a moment to think about what lockdown, and today with new stricter measures coming in some of our big cities, what is it like for those who live in high-rise residential buildings, which have already been identified as in need of remediation? For those people, their homes have become like a prison. They don't feel safe, but they're having to spend much more time there, and they can't move on, especially not if they're leaseholders, because the value of their property has been wiped out until the remediation is done. The problem is made even worse by the fear that they will have to find the money to fix the problem, which many simply cannot afford, and which was not of their doing in the first place. Every one of us has experienced major change in our lives in recent months. The way we work, speaking at conferences like this, unable to travel and to socialize as we used to. But I regard myself as very lucky when I compare my experience to those who've been locked down in high-rise buildings. This is one of the reasons that I'm pressing for change to ensure that we transform this sector and deliver safe, quality homes for everyone, not just in the future, but also fixing the shameful legacy of more than 2 decades of regulatory system failure. So what progress has been made on building safety in recent months? It was announced in February that the new building safety regulator will be set up within the Health and Safety Executive. And in addition to my role as chair of the Industry Safety Steering Group, of which I'll speak more in a moment, I now chair the Transition Board, which is overseeing of the new regulator and the transfer of functions from the Department of Communities and Local Government to the new building safety regulator. We meet monthly to review progress. We've had 8 meetings so far this year. The recruitment for the new and important post of Chief Inspector of Building Safety was launched only last week and will be appointed early in 2021. But the most significant milestone was the launch in July of the draft Building Safety Bill, which is now undergoing pre-legislative scrutiny before being formally introduced for full parliamentary debate. The Building Safety Bill, along with the Fire Safety Order, which is already well advanced in its passage into legislation, will bring about a radical change in approach to building regulation and will drive that delivery of better, safer buildings. Tragedies like Grenfell Tower must never happen again, either in new buildings or in those which already exist, which do not meet those required standards of safety. The new regime, which will fully enter into force in 2023, will require a real change in culture, attitude, and performance across the whole process of designing, constructing, maintaining, and managing safety in high-rise, higher-hazard residential buildings. In keeping with the recommendations of my review, Building a Safer Future, the legislation will tackle the highest risk buildings in a proportionate way, whilst at the same time seeking to raise standards across the whole industry. No longer will it be possible for developers, designers, and building owners to say that they did what the rules told them, or worse still, the rules didn't say I couldn't. They will need to demonstrate that the buildings they work on or manage in occupation have been built safely and will be kept that way. Responsibilities and duties will be clear at every stage in the process. I want to emphasize one very important point here about the new regulatory system. It will apply to existing buildings within scope as well as to those that are built in the future. With that scope currently set to apply to all residential buildings above 18 metres, the best estimate of the number of existing buildings to which the new regime will apply is around 13,000. Current inspection intelligence indicates that a significant number of those existing stock of buildings will require further remediation work beyond the current focus on replacement of cladding. I suspect that some of you are already doing the sums in your heads and working on the assumption that if the legislation doesn't come into force until 2023, that leaves a period of 2 to 3 years before you really need to worry about this and about changes to current practices and behaviours. But I would suggest to you that to do that is akin to going out on a big party on a night before lockdown in the current pandemic. You're knowingly taking a risk you don't need to and which you shouldn't, and you are ignoring the potential consequences. It is also morally indefensible. Knowing that the legislation is coming should be reason enough to make changes to your current practices and certainly to start the debates in your boardrooms about whether you want to be among the leaders in this sector. The case for doing so not only has a strong moral argument, but also makes business sense by ensuring that buildings are built to the right standards now and avoiding costly rectification and remediation work and possible financial penalties later. I know that that proposition immediately raises the obvious question for some of you about how can I be sure of what the right standards are until I see the detail of the legislation? So let's tackle that issue now. First of all, the new regulatory regime will require industry to make a major step change in its approach to the management and control of fire and structural risks in buildings. The gateway safety case and permissioning functions will operate on the basis that it is for the relevant duty holder, the principal designer, principal contractor, building safety manager, to demonstrate to the regulator that they have the necessary leadership, management capability, and systems in place to ensure safety throughout the life cycle of a building. This means that duty holders will need to employ competent people, they will need to document what actually gets built, and provide assurance that the right materials have been used and installed properly, as well as demonstrating that the overall safety system for the building will be effective and workable. I would ask you to think about this in relation to workplace safety, which is a much more familiar regulatory area and one where this industry has already stepped up. You know that it isn't enough to simply provide safety gear and to advise workers to follow procedures. You have to have management systems in place to ensure that they wear the right gear and that they do the job in the right way and that they are competent to do the jobs that you ask them to do. It is this same philosophy of moving away from simply doing what the rules say to ensuring that safe outcomes are delivered, which now needs to be applied to the buildings themselves. It is about good, properly motivated management systems as much and more than it is about rules. When I was chair of the Health and Safety Executive, my challenge to leaders in the highest risk and poorest performing sectors, like some parts of construction and most definitely agriculture, was often, would you want your own son or daughter to work in this industry doing the jobs that you are asking of your employees, knowing the risks that you're asking them to take? The equivalent difficult question now and in the future in relation to buildings is, would you really want your loved ones, your children, or your elderly relatives living in the buildings which you are responsible for and which you've had a hand in putting in place? This isn't just a moral question, but one of how do you and your company satisfy yourself that the buildings are safe? Whilst guidance will continue to be provided on what can be used in different applications, what changes in the new regime is the need to consider the building as a whole system. If sprinklers are not provided, why not? What other measures have you put in place to ensure that fires will not spread and that people can be safe in the buildings in the event of a fire breaking out? If cladding has been installed for thermal insulation purposes, how can you prove that the right materials were used and that they were installed correctly? Why are balconies constructed of timber? Do they not add an unnecessary fire risk to the building? I'm not making these questions up. Those are the questions you will be asked by the regulator in future. And the onus will be on you to prove safety to the regulator. Falling back on what the rules say you can and can't do on specifics will not satisfy that overall system safety question. How does this overall building work in practice? How is it designed to work in the event of fire and ensure that people are safe? This requires new thinking and new approaches, as well as an urgent step up in competencies and record keeping across the industry. And record keeping surely needs to be digital, doesn't it? That requires collaboration and sharing across the supply chain in a way that sometimes seems to be quite alien to this sector. Yet another part of the culture change that's required is to be less adversarial and more collaborative. These are all practices that can and should be starting now, well ahead of legislation. But let's get back to my earlier point about whether you choose to be a leader or a follower. As I said, I've now been chairing the Industry Safety Steering Group for more than 2 years. We published our second annual report back in July, and there was a lot of good news to share. Housing associations, landlords, architects, construction companies, construction product suppliers, and many more who have already chosen to be first adopters of the new approaches and are indeed leading the way. I also want to pay a huge tribute to the many people from across the sector who've come together to address the skills and knowledge gaps and to produce a comprehensive framework of competencies required for the new regime. But that second annual report, which we wrote in July, also highlights areas where progress is still far too slow within the industry. Too many companies still waiting for legislation, still saying they need to see detail before they can act and before they commit to change. So let's look at some more good reasons why it's now time to act and to stop waiting. The competence framework, as I said, is an excellent document, but at the moment it's a statement as what is required for when the new regime comes into force. Just over 2 years is not very long to address all of those competence requirements, and some would argue they're required right now, not in 2 years' time. So action is needed to turn the plan into reality and to start to build the skills within the workforce across the sector. Secondly, the ISSG annual report made clear that we want to find ways to identify and recognise the leaders and to differentiate them from the laggards. We've heard really exciting ideas from the Considerate Constructors Scheme and others about ways in which we might be able to do this and to quality assure companies across the sector who have built the capacity and who show that leadership to be able to have confidence in the quality of their work and their outputs. We want those who are doing the right thing to be recognised by the market, as well as providing additional assurance to the regulator. Thirdly, the new regulator will inherit a similar philosophy to that of the organisation to which it will become part, that of HSE. Smart regulators, like HSE and the new building safety regulator, work with those who are demonstrably trying to do the right thing and who need advice and support to get it right. They are much tougher on those who seek to game the system or otherwise duck out of their legal and moral responsibilities. Now, I'm not going to pretend other than that there is a huge amount of work to do to deliver this new regime over the next 2 years, both from industry and from government. The economic environment has changed dramatically this year, which adds to that challenge for everyone. But we cannot let that get in the way of addressing this national scandal of high-rise buildings of dubious quality where residents simply do not feel safe. This is a crowded island. People choose to live in high-rise, especially in cities, but in doing so, they still need to be assured of their safety. I get really angry when I hear people criticising the proposed new regime as being gold plating and creating a two-tier system. 72 people died in the most horrific way possible more than 3 years ago. They were not the first to die in fires in high-rise buildings, but we must do everything we can to make sure that such a tragedy never happens again. That's not gold plating. That is doing our moral duty as engineers and professionals to our customers and our fellow citizens. COVID has taught us some really hard lessons, and we're still learning. But what we know is that it's time we all took more care of one another and looked out for our fellow human beings, and also to recognise that none of us is exempt from responsibility. We are all part of complex systems in our lives and in our work, and we must remove the silos of self-interest. So let's stop making excuses and start making changes. You know you can, I know you can, and you know you should. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dame Judith. As usual, it is inspiring to hear the passion that you have, and we should all have that passion for change. You're, I think, quite right in pointing out that losing 72 lives is simply not acceptable. We have to change as an industry. In a few minutes, we're going to be hearing other drivers of change from David Rockhill from McKinsey & Company, but I think we have a few minutes just to talk a little bit about what you said. And one of the things that when we talked previously and hearing in your talk today is the whole thing around the moral requirement. it's very easy for us in the industry to wait for that regulation, to look for the detail. But that statement of, would you be happy for your grandmother to live in one of these buildings? So where should people start? What should they do now, knowing that we've still got the building safety bill to be to go through the process, through the Houses of Parliament, and also some of the secondary legislation? What would you say to the industry? Say, start like this. What would that be?
I think, Richard, I gave a clue to that in my presentation. For me, the place to be starting this is in boardrooms. And I think in every organisation, if that conversation hasn't already started, it should. And that conversation needs to be about, where do we sit in all of this? Are we the leaders? Do we want to be the leaders? What's the business case for being the leaders? What's the risk if we don't? And also, what's our part been in creating this shameful legacy that we've all had to deal with? That's the tough one. And certainly, I think that companies should be having those discussions. And really, because unless that leadership at the top of the organisation gets to grips with, we know we have to change, and we want to change for all of the right reasons, moral and economic, then this is going to be a tough journey if it's all about penalties to make people do it. What I want to do is to get people to a point where they see that this is absolutely something we need to do and change, because where we've been is simply unacceptable. Not simply because there's a new regulator coming who might catch us out.
And I comment that it's more than just that moral requirement. There are sensible reasons why change would take place. If we look at building information modelling, government recognised, and we'll hear from Paul Morell all about this tomorrow, recognised that this was a better way of working. It delivered better results more efficiently. And if I look at one area which was a passion for me, was back in the 1980s and the various disasters in the football industry. I watched from the hills above Bradford as Valley Parade set on fire with the loss of over 50 lives. There was Hazel and Hillsborough, and a recognition in that sector that change had to take place. Yeah. And whilst we got these new football stadia, we also got a transformed economy around football and a better way of experiencing the game. We all need to find ways of getting a better experience, and that safe experience, so people can feel comfortable. You mentioned mortgage prisoners, or well, the people who were trapped because of their mortgages. And you also mentioned that based on estimates at the minute, there are over 13,000 buildings that will need to be evaluated again as part of this upcoming legislation. Does the industry have the capacity, and how does that link to the competencies that has been talked about?
I think we have to look very hard at that. I think it's unlikely that the industry has the capacity to do all of that in a very short space of time. It's very clear that even within that 13,000, there is going to be a need for the assessment of those buildings to be prioritised. And there's a good deal of intelligence that's being built up over time, ranging from the work of the protection board that the fire and rescue services are now leading on, and which the new building safety regulator is joining up with. They have committed to look at all buildings in that high-rise in scope sector by the end of 2021. And that will start to provide that intelligence base on what the problems are, and start to identify which ones need attention by the regulator first within that list. But we have to prioritise, that's for sure. But what I find incredibly frustrating when you look at the progress we've made so far in fixing the buildings that we already know need the cladding fixing, is the way in which that work gets slowed down by debates about whose fault it is, who should pay, when the real issue is the people in those buildings are there through no fault of their own. They bought or rented them in good faith, and they deserve to be living in buildings which are safe. It's terrible that they're still living there 3 years later, knowing the building is like Grenfell and hoping every night that it isn't going to burn down.
And just before we move on to our next speaker, you coined this phrase, the golden thread of information, something which is for MBS at the heart, because we believe specification and product data is that golden thread, along with the metrics that gets at, and when are we likely to know what that might be?
I think details are emerging already, but you know, the first thing I want to say is, for a golden thread to happen, this industry has got to pull up the shutters and the barriers that exist between different sectors. So it's not all about what is the data, where are the signs from this industry that what the architect wants is passed on to the people who then build, and they then report back to the architect that they've built what he or she asked for, and that information then gets passed on to the people who are going to manage the building. The first thing that's got to happen is that pipeline for the information to flow has got to be set up, and then we'll get the information moving. In relation to existing buildings, we are going to have to start with what we've got and build that up over time. So you hear a lot of people talk now about building up case histories for different buildings, but we have to devise a better system for the future and for future build, for sure.
It's wonderful to hear that the idea that we are going to use this to create that collaborative industry, get rid of those adversarial relationships, and start working together to get the right end product. So that fundamental, and once again, in the detail of the documents around the Building Safety Bill, we can see what some of the key duties of those duty holders will be, and it includes that collaborative working. So for everybody out there, you really need to know more about this, and there's a wealth of information. MBS, we've done a webinar which you can find on our website, and we'll do more about this, so we'll be able to inform you further.